Welcome back to Presidents in Politics. I am one of your hosts, Professor Caleb McGee, joined by my fellow co-host, former Congressman Ross.
Good morning.
We're going to talk about Harry S. Truman.
33rd president.
33rd president, and my goodness, what a guy. Now, obviously, we may not agree with all of his policies, but as a person, he was a cool dude. And talk about just having a challenging time to be president.
And just defining integrity as being the foundation of the role of president. And I think that comes from his upbringing,
Just
on
a farmer. Salt of the earth.
And he works the farm.
Yes.
And then is called up for World War I.
Mm-hmm.
And he's 33 years old, I think it is. I think he's 33 when he gets called up, and he's captain of an artillery battalion, and he gains the respect of all his servicemen because
I think he called them Irish bruisers.
Yes,
because they were from the inner city of Kansas City, and he talked about them like these Irish bruisers.
And they took a lot of incoming artillery, but he with his bespectacled, and he's so diminutive. He didn't look much like a soldier or anything, but he gained their respect. He gained and quite frankly, never backed down.
No, and he retires as a major, I believe.
Yeah.
I think he works all up to major and has no college education, which
none
in today's time could not be done. But he is a non-formally trained major in the United States Army.
And then comes back and decides to go into business.
And opens a haberdashery.
Yes.
With his best Jewish friend.
Yes.
Which will later influence his policies, as we'll talk about in 1948.
Right.
But his best friend is a Jewish man, and a time when anti-Semitic nature, especially in some of these regions where he is, are very high. And his best friend's this Jewish guy, and together they open this hat store. And it's kind of an utter failure.
But consider the economic conditions at the time.
Absolutely.
It's the height of the Depression.
Yes.
And he fails miserably at it.
But him and his friend, they will not declare bankruptcy and just wipe all the debt. So they want to repay everyone on the way out because of just the integrity that they both had. He is a man. He's a salt of the earth, blue collar man of integrity.
Yes, he is.
I remember reading. You and I both have read several biographies. I know the one that his daughter wrote.
Yeah.
I remember talking about his father. His father was a farmer, came from nothing. His dad's was 5'4", and because he was so diminutive, they called him Peanut. But he was known for his fighting spirit, never backed down from a fight.
Wow.
Worked the ground, just one of those guys had his hand in the clay, growing stuff his whole life. And this was the man who then raises Harry S. Truman. Truman was raised, again, with no formal education, but he was raised with a love of learning. I loved reading about this, that Harry S. Truman's father, although he also was not formally educated, he could read, and if you can read well, you can do anything.
Right.
He saved change from pulling stones when he was young, and he bought the complete works of Shakespeare. Wow. And he bought the Lives by Plutarch. And he read them himself to educate himself, and then he would read Plutarch to young Harry when he was a boy to try to put education into him. And none of these men are formally trained, but they are great critical thinkers. And you and I have said this so many times. You don't have to go get a PhD, but read.
Yes.
Read. I know it sounds so trite from the 90s.
That's kind of been the common thread through all of our presidents that we've reviewed, is that their desire to learn and to self-educate. Mm-hmm. It's been phenomenal, and he's a great example of that.
This is going to sound so corny, but readers are leaders, right?
Yeah,
I know it's just that's an old corny 80s phrase, right? I feel like it's just, but it's so true. If you can read well and you can understand material, you can do anything. Yes. And I think we see this with Truman, both his father himself. He has never formally gone to college, and he ascends to the highest office in the land. But he's not known as a dummy. He is a sharp man.
He's very sharp.
He's keen,
and he realizes this desire for politics. And he endears himself to the political boss, Tom Pendergast. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tom Pendergast is no, I would say, straight shooter. Right? He's a true political boss. Corruption is and Truman's well aware of this, but he also understands that the only way he can get elected, and he gets elected to county judge, is through him. Yeah. And he does, but yet he doesn't succumb to the pressures of the political boss, and that actually raises his stature with Tom Pendergast and the people with which he's serving.
He does something that is almost impossible in politics, and you know this much better than I do. He walks through the mud without getting dirty. Is that a good way of putting it?
Yeah, well put.
He walks through the mud without getting dirty. And I think this is one of the things we see in politicians today. Either one, they're so impeccable they refuse to walk through the mud, or two, they wallow in the mud.
Yeah.
And Truman was one of the guys, he could walk through the mud but not get dirty himself. And I don't think we've had a lot like that.
No, and I think, again, this is attributed to the fact that he was confident with who he was.
Absolutely.
And that's why, and he was anchored. I mean,
Yes,
he
was.
a very common man.
Yes.
From Independence, Missouri. He only had one daughter, Bess, but he just enjoyed being who he was.
Absolutely. Can I give you one of those quotes? I was going to say this at the end, but we gotta go ahead and talk. We talked about his quotes and the common sense man that he was. Here's what he said, and I think this is just so fitting for where we are. And this is one of my favorite quotes of his. 3 things can ruin a man.
Yeah.
You know where I'm going with this?
Oh, yeah.
Money, power, and women. I never had any money. I never wanted any power, and the only woman in my life is up at the house right now. I love that so dang much.
And that was his lifestyle. That was who he was. And it is indicative throughout his entire history with what he does. They don't expect. In fact, when the U.S. Senate seat opens, a junior Senate seat opens up in Missouri, he tries to go for it, but Pendergast won't give it to him, and then nobody else wants it. So he says, Pendergast says, all right, you run for it. And he wins the plurality and gets elected to the U.S. Senate. Yep. And then he starts establishing himself.
Yes, he serves on the the Senate War Investigation Committee, because there's so much, and you know this. There's so much corruption that happens a lot of times in war with profiteering from companies, and what's so brutal about this is they're stealing actually from the soldiers on the ground, right?
Yeah.
And this happened a lot in War I. It happened a lot again in War II, where companies were taking contracts, high-level money. They were giving inferior products and less than to the soldiers on the ground, and then they were banking this massive amount of money. So Truman sits on this Senate Committee of Investigation, and I think it was estimated that he saved the country something like $15 billion.
Yes, that's what he has.
Okay.
Yeah.
Somewhere around $15 billion.
Isn't that amazing?
They snort out this corruption. The fraud that takes place.
Yeah.
And like you said, he builds a name for himself as a senator.
And that again endears himself because remember, at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a very powerful president.
Yes.
And
charismatic.
Very charismatic. And he had just won his 4th term. And he had just won his 3rd term. And going into his 4th election, he decides that he's going to change horses with his vice president, and he enlists Harry Truman. Why? Because Truman was just an easy guy.
Yeah.
You know, salt of the earth. And he's not controversial.
He was kind of what FDR wasn't, and the FDR, and again, Roosevelt was such a charismatic. We can't just beat up on him. Such a charismatic, solid leader for that time in American history.
Yeah.
But the one thing that every biographer wrote about Roosevelt was that he was not forthright. He was not plain spoken.
No.
And I can't remember the biographer. There was a biographer that wrote on FDR in not a very favorable light, and he made the statement that if Roosevelt thought that cannibalism would win him votes, he would start fattening a missionary on Wednesday, right? That was Roosevelt. And then Truman is just this farmer, salty. He's going to tell you what he thinks. He had a bit of a temper at times.
Yes.
And he had salty language at times.
Yes, he did.
But he was just known for, you knew where you stood with him.
Absolutely.
You always knew where you, and there's something to be said of that.
Especially at the time that he ascends to the presidency.
Yes.
Because he comes in, within 2 months of taking the oath, 3 months of taking the oath of office?
Hardly any time in the executive branch at all.
And he knows nothing. Nobody briefed him on anything. Roosevelt dies. He's getting sworn in. And that's when he learns
about the Manhattan Project.
The Manhattan Project.
Yes.
And the atomic bomb. And in the meantime, he's got to go do the Potsdam Conference to decide how they're going to divvy up Europe after the war. He's got I think a railroad strike. He's got all things thrown at him that he wasn't prepared for. And
the Cold War beginning.
The beginning of the Cold War. But he has to make the decision about the atomic bomb.
Yes.
And I think this is what he was criticized for at first, but then when people saw what happened in Okinawa, and it was estimated that we would lose at least 500,000 soldiers trying to invade Japan, that he said enough is enough.
Yeah, and with civilian casualties, I think the numbers get something like 2 million lives.
Yes, and he had given an ultimatum for an unconditional surrender to Japan, and they said no way, so he dropped the first one, and dropped the second one.
Little man and fat boy.
Yeah. And there you go, the end of the war. And that was just the beginning of the challenges for him.
Yes.
You know, you think after that things are supposed to get easy, but no.
No.
And then we saw happening in Europe, like you just mentioned about the Cold War, is you've got Russia all of a sudden decides to say, not all of a sudden, they knew what they were doing.
Oh.
We want
Stalin was keen.
They want every bit of territory that Germany had taken that was in Eastern Europe. And so they decided to divide everything up. And
I think there was almost this ideological difference in that maybe in the back of Stalin's mind there was the assumption that when we won as the Allied powers, Russia was going to take all of Germany's land. Maybe they thought America was going to take all the South Pacific, and basically to the victor goes the spools. And then as America, we're like, we're not going to really do that. Like, we're not going to take over the South Pacific, and we're not going to let you take over Europe. And then Stalin's like, wait a minute, that's not what we really signed on for. There's this weird dynamic, and of course Roosevelt, the big three, right? The Yalta Conference, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Roosevelt, before he dies, keeps assuring Churchill, I can pretty much control Stalin. It's okay. And then Roosevelt dies, and then Truman steps in, and Truman doesn't trust Stalin, and Churchill doesn't trust Stalin. So now it's 2 against 1. Stalin feels cornered, and then the Cold War kind of breaks out. I guess that's a simple explanation of the Cold War.
But I think what was evidence of that was that Russia was starting to influence Greece.
Yes.
And Greece was having a civil war, and then influenced Turkey because they knew that apparently Russia had made a deal with Iran for oil, and the only way to get it out was through Turkey. And so they're trying to influence the governments of Turkey and Greece and have them become communists. And that's where Truman says, oh, no, we're not doing this. And he enacts what he calls the Truman Doctrine to support all those countries that are freedom-seeking democracies.
And this is based off something called domino theory that you're very familiar. Domino theory was the fear that if one country falls to communism, then every country will fall, like a set of dominoes. Once one falls, they keep knocking each other over. So when you think of things like Korea and Vietnam, the whole entire thing, these were proxy wars of the Cold War. I always tell my students, these weren't individual wars. You have the big war of the Cold War, the ideological war of communism versus capitalism, freedom versus state control. Right. And all of these little Korea, Vietnam, which if you were in them, they definitely weren't little. I'm not minimizing the effects of this war, but they were proxy wars of a much larger war. It was the Cold War at large. And Truman's in when Korea kind of breaks out, and this is one of the things that leads to him becoming very unpopular in the polls too.
Yes. In fact, when he seeks re-election. And in fact, he wasn't expected to win because Thomas Dewey, governor of New York, comes out.
That's right.
And Truman, in his second term, was actually his first full term, but his first true election, is out there, and he starts doing these whistle stops. Yeah. And he just travels all over the United States.
It's kind of old school.
It is old school, but he went where he needed to be, and plain speaking, he was able to get enough support, and he defeats Dewey. And there's that famous photograph of I guess it was the Chicago Tribune or whatever, where the headlines read, Dewey defeats Truman, and he's holding it up, smiling,
Yes.
But that wasn't a mandate, but it was a confirmation that he was the right person.
Agreed.
To be there. And then he had all these, he's the first one to desegregate the military.
I'm so glad you brought the 1948 executive order.
Yes, which was amazing because he was raised as a racist.
That's right.
I mean, his family subscribed to the Southern, the Old South. And I think what really turned him was when he became president. And this is what I love about these leaders that become president.
Is the growth.
The growth. And they realize that they're there for the benefit of all.
I like that.
Not just the party or not just the few that got them there. And he saw in World War II the mistreatment, the oppression, the lynchings of black soldiers when they came back. And he could not stand for it. And that's when he led himself to the executive order.
I love that.
It was great.
And I think part of that, too, was his time in War I. Yeah. Now, troops were segregated, so we can't say he served alongside of minorities, but he worked with minorities, and he saw the significance that played. And I believe that kind of, I think that was probably the first growth experience, was his time in War I. And then, as you said, when he saw all the injustices that took place after War II, he signs it, and we have to realize how huge this is. It's 1948, and he signs an executive order saying there's not going to be segregation in the military. You're going to have white men and black men and Hispanic men and every other race of individuals. They're going to bunk together. They're going to eat together. They're going to serve together. Yes. And this was revolutionary. Now, for you and me, that's like common sense, but it was revolutionary at the time. And in many ways, this executive order to desegregate the military is the springboard for then the civilian side of this with the amazing people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and all of these leaders. They kind of springboard off of what was already happening in the military, because it didn't make any sense where in the military we can eat together, we can bunk together, but then and once we get out of the military, now we have segregation segregated water fountains and segregated lunch halls and segregated. It didn't make any sense. So this was the first step into reintegrating society.
Amazing.
It was, and I don't think we give him enough credit for this.
No, I agree with you.
It's kind of like a footnote because if you, especially in a lot of the secular colleges today, if you walk in and you mention the name of Truman, you're going to start arguing about the atomic bombs.
Yeah,
and that's it.
Yeah, there's so much. There's so much in the Marshall Plan.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh my gosh, the rebuilding of a devastated Europe.
Yes.
Just and showing that capitalism does work.
It does. Korea is a perfect example of this. Right? Look at the 30th parallel. Look at South Korea. I always do this in my classes.
I was just there.
Yeah. You look at South Korea versus North Korea.
Stark difference.
Massive, right? And it was literally like an experiment, a real world case study of what does communism look like played out and what does capitalism look played out. And we're what, 65, 70 years removed? And now look at those two nations.
Yeah.
And I don't remember the stats off the top of my head. They were old from when I taught a class in the Korean War, but it's something ridiculous. Like the average South Korea makes 96% more than the North Korean. So look at these systems and see which one worked, and then look at what can happen if you outplay these ideals in an actual functioning society.
I was just at Panmunjom just in July, and we go to the border. Of course, that's on the border, and you see the North Korean soldiers, and their backs are to you, looking at North Korea, and the South Korean soldiers and American soldiers their backs are to South Korea. Why?
Wow.
Because North Korea knows that people are trying to get out, so they want to keep them in, and American and South Korean soldiers are there because they want to be able to help them as they come, as they try to escape. There was a little town, an artificial town just across the border that was built, and music was pumped into it to make it look like and sound like that there was an actual vibrant community, but it was a ghost town built strictly for propaganda. That's communism.
Wow. It's all show.
It's all show.
It's all show.
And of course, Truman's at that height with Joe McCarthy comes out.
Oh, absolutely.
The
Red Scare.
The Red Scare.
Yes. And you talk about some people talk government censorship today. Talk some government censorship.
Yes.
With the radio and the blacklisting of Hollywood. I mean, like it becomes an absolute witch hunt that if we even suspect that you are involved in this, we're gonna blacklist you and your grandparents and your household cat, and like you're not getting working. I mean, it's taken to a very extreme level. And it shows you, it's kind of like, again, I taught a class a couple semesters ago on the history and politics of the Salem witch trials. And it shows you yet again, when you get hysteria in a community. The
mob mentality that takes over.
There's a demon behind every tree.
Yeah, you're right.
When in doubt, cast it out. You see it everywhere. And that was a real thing with the Red Scare. But I got to go back to the atomic bomb. And again, I don't want to just sit on this, but I remember when I was a personal trainer and I was working with this elderly guy. I told you this story. There was an elderly guy. He was in his 90s. One of my favorite guys I ever worked with, and he had been a Seabee in the Navy during World War II. And we were just chatting. He was in his 90s at this point, and I'm like, hey man, what's history. We're talking about history. Who's your favorite, baseball player of all time? He was a New York Yankees fan. I didn't hold that against him. And we were going through all this stuff. I'm like, who's your favorite president of all time? I'll never forget. He said it was Truman because he had the guts to drop the bomb, and I got to go home.
Wow.
And I thought, it's easy for us to look back now and criticize that decision. And of course, we have to talk about the loss of human life. And it was all war's tragedy. That's the one thing that I'm always kind of amazed of when I hear students like, well, it was such a huge tragedy. It was a massive tragedy. I'm not going to downplay the loss of human life.
You're right.
But boots on the ground, when they come on and you start firing shots, and at that time even using napalm, other things we were using, those are also indiscriminate killers. You're going to have loss of life. You're going to have collateral damage. You're going to lose citizens in the fray of war. How was that one event necessarily any more devastating than the island hopping that was going on until this point? And according to Truman, this was actually going to cause less civilian lives. Now, again, we can argue if that was true or not, but I can tell you from the veterans I've spoken to, I've talked to a lot of World War II veterans at my church, they loved Truman for this decision.
Yeah, and again, you got to look at Okinawa. I mean, that was the last major battle.
Yes.
That a great deal loss of life of military soldiers, a lot of civilians. Civilians were just jumping off cliffs because they didn't want to be taken by the American soldiers.
Exactly.
And it would have happened even worse in Japan.
Yes.
And it was probably the best of the worst decisions to drop the bomb.
Yes.
And thank God he did do that, because that put an end to it.
And he only has, as you said, a few weeks, at the most a couple months to deal with this decision. Can you imagine you've been in politics, can you imagine coming to office because of death, you walk behind in a room, they close the doors, we have a meeting we have to have with you, very, very serious. They bring out the paper, and there's this thing called the Manhattan Project, and we're literally going to harness the power of the sun, is what they call it this time. They call it the power of the sun. We're going to harness the power of the sun, and we can almost blow up an entire island. Do you want to use it or not? Take your time.
Yeah, and he's at the Potsdam conference, I think, when he gets word that the atomic bomb availability.
And they're divvying up, as you said, Europe. They literally basically sit down with a map, and they're like, hey, how are we going to redistribute the land of Europe?
Yeah, and that in and of itself was a major dislocation of a lot of people.
Oh, yes.
Yes. But today,
He made the statement, I know you have several of those quotes as well. He made the statement talking about becoming president. He said, I felt like the moon and the stars and all the planets had just fallen on me. I'm sure that's kind of what it felt like in that time to have to become president during one of the really roughest times in American history and in world history, right?
Yeah.
And you talk the Marshall Plan, he spends $13 billion trying to rebuild Europe. And his plan, which works beautifully,
and the Berlin Airlift, too.
The Berlin Airlift, which is a master of military engineering, by the way.
Yeah.
It's a masterpiece of military engineering that we're literally going to supply a country that's basically blockaded.
Yeah,
and we're going to do it by air.
Yeah.
And it works. It works pretty dang well.
Yeah.
So it's an amazing feat, if you will, of engineering in the late 1940s and early 1950s. I mean, it's a massive thing. But he talked a lot about the Marshall Plan. And his plan was basically, if we rebuild Europe from the economic ashes and we make them stronger, then they're more likely to be our allies. And you and I have talked about this a lot. That works. It's Adam Smith philosophy.
Absolutely.
If I'm making money off of you and you're making money off of me, we're going to want to protect each other.
Yes, we're enjoying a good life.
Exactly. If we can have good lives together and you're trading and I'm trading, I'm not going to want to go to war with you.
Right. Look at Japan.
Look at Japan. We just talked about this in class this morning in my political philosophy class. We compared Japan to Vietnam and the strategies we took, both the aggressive strategy of taking it quickly and then the rebuilding strategy. And once we actually signified a true victory, we signified a true victory, we took the land, and then we rebuilt and became allies versus this in between kind of not really sure what was going on.
Right.
So maybe it's peace through strength, as Reagan would say, peace through aggression.
Yeah.
I don't know, right? That's not popular in today's time,
no,
right?
It isn't,
at all.
Unfortunately.
But
I mean, going back to what he was famous known for, of course, was the United Nations.
Yes.
I mean, he was very strong and supportive of that, and then we talked about before the podcast, of course, was his recognition of Israel.
Yes, we got to get into that.
Because of his friend, that was fascinating. I mean, here you've got this partition, which all started with the Balfour Declaration way back in, I think, 1917, and then finally
the British kind of messed up the whole.
Oh gosh, yes, and you had the Jews that were fighting the British in what was then called Palestine, in Jerusalem, and they.
And you hear the argument a lot. Well, why did America have to recognize Israel so quickly? Well, there's a few reasons for it, and one of them that we can, because we don't have time to get into the geopolitics, but one of them is you have hundreds of thousands of Jews displaced from Nazi Germany, including many Holocaust survivers. They have nothing to go back to.
No place to go.
Exactly, and what they want now is their homeland. So, of course, it was, and again, even Truman's Secretary of State at the time is saying we just need to take a few years. There weren't a few years. You have Jewish people that are coming that are displaced. They have nowhere to go, and they're saying, okay, let's reopen the Holy Land. And now the British plan is going out. It's phasing out. That part is over, and now you got to redecide what we're going to do with this land region that's been called Palestine. And now we have displaced Jews coming in, and there's the creation of the State of Israel on May 14th, 1948.
Yeah.
And Truman recognizes it in something like 11 minutes after it's stated, against the advice of his Secretary of State, including his Secretary of State said that he would resign if he did it. And Truman's like, fine. And he does it. And guess what? He doesn't resign.
No, he doesn't resign.
Because that's usually a veiled threat with those high positions of power.
But it didn't require us to put boots on the ground.
No, it did not.
And Israel, because of their self-determination, defended themselves against the Arab.
They fight the first Arab war for 1 year.
Yeah.
And are pretty successful in this. Outnumbered, outgunned. In fact, there is still some British support on the Arab side. And Israel still is able to be pretty successful in this.
Yeah, which is amazing,
yes.
Even though it goes on today.
Yes. So again, this is one of the first times 600,000 displaced Jews leave Europe, and specifically a lot of them from previously held Nazi territories, and they come to Israel, and there's the command or the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, and he steps up and he becomes one of the first leaders. The Hebrew language is reinstituted.
Yes, it is.
We've got to talk about that. Like up until this point, the Hebrew language had still been written, right?
Right, but it wasn't practiced.
It wasn't spoken. Yeah. And you have several leaders who step in and they reinstitute. So basically, talk about a nation being born in a day. Basically, you have a nation reborn, a language brought out of extinction, a military reformed, and all of it's just happening at light speed.
And again, you look at capitalism. Since 1948, they've been known as the startup nation. They are the economic engine of the Middle East.
Absolutely.
Amazing. High tech, agriculture, you name it, logistics, they are amazing.
Yes, and more individuals from Israel have won Nobel Peace Prizes in the last, 50 years than any other country, in multiple countries combined, actually.
Peace prizes.
Peace Prizes, yeah. So they are... it's just Eddie Jacobson, by the way, was his friend, his Jewish friend. They go into hat making business together, and also we have to talk about the fact that Truman. I was listening to a lecture from. I think it was Hebrew University. I'm trying to remember, it was an Israeli college, and their professors were talking about the fact that Truman, as you said, was raised in a racist home in the South, right? But their neighbors were actually Jewish, and Truman actually really enjoyed like playing with the Jewish kids, so much that he would even go to Sabbat sometimes with them. And this becomes like a big part of his life. And again, you just see these little things. It's amazing.
Which are fascinating. A Shabbat is just one of the most wonderful experiences. It's like a Thanksgiving every Friday evening.
Shabbat is just amazing. It really is, right? And he has taught this appreciation for culture. And I like what you said. One of the things we have to do with history is we have to look at people where they're, the culture and context they were in, and then allow for their growth and their integrity. A lot of times with this idea of cancel culture, we look at individuals who are just indicative of their culture, and we go, well, they're horrible people. But what I love to see are Trumans who rise above that.
Oh,
right?
Amazing.
He's raised in a racist, anti-Semitic culture. He becomes best friends with a Jewish guy. He reinstates the nation of Israel. He desegregates the military. He becomes friends with African-American guys because he grows past the culture he's in. When you know better, you do better.
Exactly.
Right?
Well put.
And that's one of the things you really
that's
see
the
with
mark
a life.
Of a great leader.
Agreed. You've got to be able to grow past your own inborn biases.
He's the first president to give an address before the NAACP.
That's correct.
At the Lincoln Memorial.
That's correct.
He tried to bridge.
Yes.
I think the more he learned, the more he realized he had to be inclusive as a leader, which we desperately need today.
He's just a common sense guy.
Yes. You know, his famous quote, the buck stops here.
Yeah.
And it was on his desk.
Yeah.
And he believed that. He also said that if you want a friend in Washington, D.C., get a dog.
I actually really like that.
That's a good one.
I feel like
I could have
hung out with this guy.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I remember, and I'm paraphrasing here, one of my favorites was he said that becoming president is like riding a tiger. Either ride him or get off and get swallowed by it.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm paraphrasing. I probably slaughtered that quote.
No, that was very good. That was close to it.
But I like that mentality. It almost becomes larger than yourself, right? Yeah. The momentum of what you're on is you kind of have to ride it till the end, because if you fall off, it's going to run over you.
Well, one interesting thing is the only presidential museum in Florida is in Key West in the Little White House, because he spent 11 visits down here. Spent a lot of time. He had a respiratory condition, and down there at the Navy base, I visited it if you haven't. It's a wonderful thing.
I'll have to check it out.
And it's he would go down there and do a lot of his work from Key West.
Wow.
Which was rather fascinating.
Yes.
That was like that. He also, when he left office, he didn't seek re-election. When he left office, there was no presidential pension.
That's right.
He was the last president to not have a presidential pension. And we visited his
very modest farm home.
Very, very well. Yes, it is a very modest farm home, and he was there actually helping build, giving guidance to how to build his presidential library. And he would go. My wife and I had dinner in a restaurant in Independence, Missouri, and the manager of the place said he was a little kid when Harry was retired, because he died in 1972. But Harry would come to their classes and talk to them. This is. After he was president.
Former president.
Yeah, former president. And he comes to the classes and just talks to the students. He's out there just like a regular guy helping build his library. And in fact, him and Bess are both buried on the grounds there.
Wow.
Just a fascinating story. An amazing man who did so much for our nation.
I think sometimes just keeping that connection to the land, to work, to blue collar, getting your hands dirty sometimes, it grounds you as a leader. I think a lot about Ronald Reagan, who would go back to his ranch, and there's those famous pictures of him like in his blue jeans and his chainsaw, like cutting trees up and stuff like that. There's something to be said of that. I think a lot about George Washington Carver.
Yeah.
And when he was president there in Alabama of the college.
Yeah, Tuskegee.
Tuskegee, thank you, Tuskegee. There was one time that a kind of a racist, wealthy white woman tried to hire him to chop wood for her because she didn't know who he was. She just saw him out like in blue jeans and a flannel shirt. And he goes to her house and chops wood, and then is like, "No, I don't really need the pay, thanks." And then goes back. Later, she finds out who he was, and she was so embarrassed that she goes up to his presidential office and she's like, "I am so sorry. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were basically a common day laborer. I didn't realize you're the president of Tuskegee College. You're president of a university." And I'll never forget reading his biography. He's like, "Ma'am, it's okay. I need to put my hands into some common work every now and then to remind myself that I'm still a man."
Wow.
And I thought
What a
about that. I
great
thought about like
sense
our
of humility.
modern like leaders. And when was the last time that we've had presidents who go out and still chop wood?
Yeah, you're right, Reagan.
Yeah, right.
That's the only one I can think of.
Me too. And I honestly think that if we had that sense of just sometimes doing common work again, maybe to reground our leaders.
I couldn't agree more.
I know
He's a great example to follow.
I think he's a perfect example of this. One thing too that I thought was so interesting. I remember reading some Jewish authors writing, and that when Truman recognized the state of Israel in 1948, he walked into, I think it was a church or synagogue the following week, and he said, "I'm Cyrus." He saw himself, because he grew up reading the Bible, he saw himself in the Old Testament as Cyrus, who allowed the Jews to return home and to rebuild the temple. Like he saw himself in a biblical standpoint. He grew up reading the Bible. He was a Baptist. He's a hardcore follower of Scripture, and he actually, one of the reasons why he recognized Israel is because of his interpretation of the Old Testament. And I find that really interesting. That again, what he read affected him. It impacted him.
Yeah.
So Truman, just a salt of the earth, blue collar, technically not formally educated, but well-read.
And again, the right person at the right time.
Yeah, 100% agree. We needed a plain-spoken, common farmer after maybe the flashiness of the Roosevelts. But again, we can't just knock Roosevelt. You and I have said so many times we see the providential hand of God rising up the right leader at the right time.
Yeah, and even Truman took on, and in his second term, he had what he called the fair deal. So I mean, there's still an influence, a strong influence. Of course, today there's a strong influence from the New Deal of FDR.
That's right.
So,
and then it will see its next great fruition under LBJ with the Great Society, which then stretched it even more, right?
Yeah.
And you keep seeing the growth of the federal government, of centralized power. But yeah, this has been Harry Truman, and then I guess next week is Eisenhower.
Eisenhower.
Great military leader and interesting president, and that'll be a fun one. So,
it will be.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.